and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We are commencing the baton death march of stockpiling podcasts this week and next, so that I can take some time off. And so we're recording at a weird hour on a weird day, but I wanted to get today's guest back. Seemed like a great opportunity to do that. Shawn Bushway, he's a professor at the State University at Albany. I've been told that that's the correct way to say it. They're not quite as obnoxious about it as the Ohio State University, but give them time. He's also an adjunct researcher at the Rand Corporation, which is probably the closest real life gets to what Hollywood thinks think tanks are like, as someone who's spent a lot of time in the think tank world. And Shawn, you spent a lot of time studying crime and recidivism and all the rest, and you have a new pile of research, which people can find. We'll put in the show notes. Resetting the Record, the Facts on Hiring People with Criminal Histories. And it's actually a compilation of a bunch of research that you and your colleagues have been doing. So first of all, welcome back to the Remnant.
Hey, thanks for having me. You're famous. I got at least 3 people that noticed it after I was on your show. So very nice.
Let's go for 5. Anybody who listens to this who knows Shawn, say, hey, I heard you on Jonah's podcast. Let's see what number we get.
Okay, I'll report back.
Please do. Please do.
I have to admit, one of them was my dad.
There's no shame there. Your dad is a discerning and fine American. Thank you, Mr. Bushway. So, why don't we just sort of, before we get into the research stuff, because it's not the end of the story, but just sort of some level setting. Last time we had you on, it was because everyone was freaking out about crime. People are still freaking out about crime, but it feels like the numbers are moving in the right direction for the most part. And I'm not saying, look, I mean, it is a rule of journalism going back since the beginning of journalism that crime is always self-justifying as a news story. It's all about the amplitude and the context that you give it. So I'm not trying to say that people should stop covering crime. People should always cover crime. Local news maybe covers it too much or in a sensational way sometimes. It feels like it's taking on a bit of a more of a political frequency than I think you could argue a couple years ago. So anyway, with all that throat clearing, where do things stand?
Well, fortunately, firearm homicides, which is the thing that really spiked, are decreasing in most cities. Not as much as I think we would like. And since obviously homicides are the thing that most people worry about, it's the thing that causes the type of crime that causes the most harm. That increase has been a big deal, and the decrease should also be reassuring that there does seem to be some declining there. Again, we'd like to see more. The overall crime rate relative to, not including but not limited to homicides, actually going down, continues to go down. And I think, with your story, with respect to the media, and one of the issues that's related to that is that everyone always thinks that crime is going up or that crime is bad, except in their neighborhood. And, the fact of the matter is crime hasn't been as low as it is now in the United States since the 1960s. And that is, continuing to be true in lots of different dimensions. And then the good news that we sometimes lose on that is that crime is particularly down in the African American community, which is really good news. And so the racial disparity in the criminal justice system has dropped across a number of different measures and different points of entry into the view. And that's all very good news. It doesn't mean we're done or that that everything's as good as it could be, but it does seem like there are a lot of positive stories coming out of the criminal justice and crime side that often don't get featured in the media.
So again, I fully understand that the plural of anecdote is not data and that these things don't have uniformity across the country. It's some of it's regional, all that.
Right.
But in Washington, D.C., carjackings have been on the rise. I don't know, maybe they've ticked down recently, but they've been definitely on the rise for the last few years. And moreover, they've been on the move in the sense that they've been happening in neighborhoods that, would shock you if you lived in DC to find out there was a carjacking. Recently not too long ago, there was a carjacking in Bethesda, Maryland, in a nice neighborhood where my daughter would frequent. And so obviously I care more about it because it scares me. I guess the way to ask this is sometimes people figure out some new crime, right? It's and then it has this long tail because you get adopters to it who figure it out and they're going to ride that practice until the penalties or the rewards fix the cost benefit analysis. Is carjacking seems to be one of those things.
I mean, the ones that I'm more familiar with are the gang shopliftings and the catalytic converter thefts, which are also common in places like Chevy Chase and Bethesda, from what I understand, and becoming, didn't exist. Catalytic converter theft wasn't really a thing until recently. So, I mean, it isn't to say that, I think there are two things. One is that those types of crimes are, a little hard to track, especially since people don't always report them. But the levels of crime that we're experiencing, even with that, are nowhere near where they were in, say, the 90s and 80s. And so I think, should we be worried about these things? Sure. But is it anywhere near the level of concern that we had in the 80s and 90s? No. And, is there some risk that these concerns will drive the politics such that we make some of the same mistakes that we made in the 80s and 90s vis-a-vis criminal justice policies that led to the fourfold increase in the number of people incarcerated, large increases in racial disparity? I think those are legitimate concerns that people have. And to the extent to which we can understand the problem, I think it helps a lot. And I think knowing, for example, that young people today, I mean, there's some new results that are just stunning, right? So do you remember back in the, during the presidential elections where everyone said 30% of African-American men were going to be in prison by age 30? Do you remember that? It's only been cited 16,000 times, right? There's a report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Well, those people are now, you can actually look, that was a prediction made by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2000. You can actually look now in 2020 and see what those rates are. And then the actual rate is like 15%, which is obviously not great. It's still really high, but it's nowhere near 30%. And the prevalence of people under the age of 25 in the prison system is dropped in half. So we're talking about massive drops particularly among young people. And there's a growing understanding in criminal justice and criminology about these cohort effects, where you see birth cohorts that are coming of age now that have much lower levels of involvement in crime than, say, you and I, the Generation X, had in the 80s and 90s. And it's stunning. And it's unlikely those are going to reverse, right? The peak periods of crime for people in their life course are in their early 20s and late teens. And you don't get those back, right? And these people have already passed through that period where they're at very low levels of crime and criminal justice involvement. So, I mean, I think you got to, think about that and try to not exacerbate the problem, because those people are exiting. And you don't want to trap them in the system. And I think that's what happened before was, we had a period where a lot of young people got involved in crime, and we created rules that emphasized prior punishment such a way that we kept them in the snake for a very long time. And I think that's a big concern a lot of people have, is that we don't learn our lessons from the 80s. We'll end up creating another huge bubble that stays with us for a long time without necessarily reducing crime.
So let me ask you, I can't remember if we talked about it last time. What is your view of broken window policing?
Well, I mean, obviously there's lots of different definitions of broken window policing, and in terms of what exactly it means and how it gets implemented. I think the idea that the foundational idea of broken windows was that a community that has order is going to be less susceptible to misbehavior by residents or visitors than if it was not ordered. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that, what Rob Sampson calls, collective efficacy matters, that even communities that are poor, if they have a sense of working together and enabled to solve problems as a community, they will have less crime than places that don't. And policing can contribute to that in some way, but it can also degrade that. So it becomes a question of disorder policing, right? So this is the model that happened under Bill Bratton in New York City, where the conversation was about using the police to create order. So dealing with the squeegee men or whatever it was. and that probably had some impact. The problem is if it becomes a quota or some type of feature where that's the only thing you're trying to do, and you're not paying attention to the larger community culture that you're trying to create. So, I mean, I think there's evidence that proactive policing definitely works, right? And broken windows, what you're calling broken windows policing, is a component of that. And that's a decision by the National Academy of Sciences. But there are also risks, right? Because being proactive means you're going to go to places that are more crime prone or have more crime reported, and you're going to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And so that runs the risk of alienating people. It runs the risk of creating a sense that people are being targeted. So there are risks involved, but the evidence is that, and that's worth paying attention to, but the evidence is that it does work.
First of all, I want to talk about the shoplifting stuff because I think that gets misreported a lot. It is less to do with miscreant individual young people than it has to do with actually it's essentially organized crime, right? And there's a role that things like the internet play in it because you have now this ability to resell purloined stuff from Walgreens or Rite Aid or whatever. But I guess just again, for the sort of level setting of this is like, what is your preferred explanation? I predict it will be nuanced and complicated, but what is your preferred explanation for why crime went down and then started going up?
Yeah, it's actually, I'm glad that you think I'm nuanced and complicated, but in this particular case, I may disappoint you.
Uh-huh.
I think the reason why crime went down is that the things that caused the crime boom stopped. I don't think explanations about like lead or other things like that are particularly compelling because we didn't go down to levels, for example, consider the debate about lead or abortion, right? That the idea that these things happened in the 70s and then, then the crime started dropping in the mid 90s when kids that were affected by these things reached, the peak ages of crime. Well, the crime rates dropped, but they dropped to levels that we saw in the 60s. And I don't know about you, but there was a lot of lead and, not abortion happening in the 50s and 60s. And so to me, that doesn't seem very compelling. Yet I understand that, in the United States and in most countries, there are crime booms. And there are sets of the things that caused crime boom in this period are going to be different than the things that caused crime boom back in the 80s. In the 80s, it was crack. And so the white flight and the movement out of the cities of businesses that kind of came together to create the perfect storm for crime. And those things eventually dissipated, right? Enough people died, enough people decided this is enough that those things stopped. And so the social contextual features that created the incentives and motivation for crime disappeared. And so we had a crime drop. And that's why it's so important to focus on these cohort differences. I mean, I'm talking about 10 years, take two birth cohorts, 10 years apart in Chicago. Probably that the latter cohort that came of age in the 2000s has an arrest by age 20 is 50% lower than the group that came of age in the 1990s. That's insane, right? That means that it's the environment. I mean, these kids grew up with the same type of family environments, with the same level of poverty, et cetera, as the other kids did, but they weren't growing up in a time period where crime was exceptionally prevalent, and where the features of crime were prevalent. So they are much less involved in crime. And I think so. Why did crime go down? Because the things that caused the crime boom stopped. And that's what happens with crime booms. There are a set of conditions that exist and then they go down. I mean, if you think about what happened in the most recent crime boom, I think COVID had a lot to do with it. I think George Floyd had a lot to do with it. And and COVID because of the absence of police on the streets, but also because of the absence of schooling, right? We had entire communities where all of the teenagers, 80% of the kids in high school weren't in school. And we have very clear studies that show when kids are not in school, they do lots of other things, right? I mean, this is not surprising. So, and what's going on now is the renormalization where people are in school and there's more movement in commercial centers and things like that. And so to me, it's the absence of the thing that caused the crime boom that leads to the crime drop.
So a layman listening to that, I mean, there's something on the one hand, there's something profoundly conservative about it, right? Which is sort of that what is it? Edmund Burke says, example is the school of mankind and he will learn no other. Sometimes younger people have to see the mistakes of the people just a little bit older than them and see how unpleasant that is. And they say, I don't want to do that. And societies and communities adjust bad behavior by condemning bad behavior and all that. I get all that. But it also sounds like your narrative is remarkably devoid of actual public policy successes or failures in that story, right? It is simply that there are exogenous conditions that lead to, I mean, it makes sense in some sense in terms of like the pandemic stuff, but crime did go down dramatically. There are a lot of politicians on the left and the right who argue about what the public policies were that led to it. And I mean, other than proactive policing, which is it sort of a double-edged sword, or as a cost benefit, has trade-offs to it, which I think is probably indisputable. Are there not public policies that either through failure or success affected the way the line moved on the graph when it comes to crime over the last 25 years?
So the first thing that I think is worth pointing out is that it's really hard to explain anything that goes up and down pretty much everywhere. So that's, as a causal story, you'd like to have things that went up in one place and down in another, and you can see where places that went up, what happened to them, and places that went down, what happened to them. And so it's very hard to explain national trends of anything. The second thing is that, it isn't the case that people don't think incarceration led to some of the, for example, the increased use of incarceration led to declines in crime. It's just not given all of the credit. It's given 20% of the credit. And so, and you have a bunch of things that account for some percentage of the reduction. But, the New York City story is one that often gets cited because of the problem-oriented policing. But crime went down to lots of places, including places that didn't have problem-oriented policing. Now, New York City was particularly dramatic. And so I think I wouldn't say exogenous in the sense, I think it's largely endogenous in the sense that there's the stock market is pretty endogenous, right? And there's a response. And at the end of the day, there's no signal left. It's all noise because people are responding to the information they get. And that's what's happening, I think, in the market for crime, where people do respond by moving away or, buying more security, or, enough people join gangs that the returns to gang activity drop. So there's evidence, like say, the wages from participating in crime went way down. For drugs went way down in the 80s and 90s. Whereas the returns used to be fairly high, they're basically minimum wage. So there's lots of things that change, but I think the issue here is social context matters a lot. And I'm not sure that's necessarily conservative, because a lot of liberals want to talk about social context, right? And the community environments. And we do have evidence that things like poverty, right? Childhood poverty dropped 50% in the last 20 years. Did that have an impact? I wouldn't be surprised if it did. Can I prove it? Not really, because it's the kind of thing where child poverty went up and down for pretty much everybody, right? It's not like there are some places that received EITC benefits and other places that didn't. So I think that it's just very hard to show, but I don't think what I'm saying is it just sort of happens with nobody responding, but I think it's a larger set of things that are happening in response to whatever is happening that eventually makes the crime boom go away. For example, a lot of the activity in the mid 80s was about open air drug markets. Well, what do you know about the 1990s? Cell phones, right? So now there are very few open air drug markets in the United States, right? Because that's not how you do business anymore. And that results in a lot less violence. And so I think, there are examples, they're idiosyncratic, right? And that they're true for across different environments. And the very nature of crime booms in the United States is that every crime boom is different, right? And so you can't predict what's going to happen, and you can explain it in retrospect. But the factors are always different, and the responses are always different. But again, remember that kids who grew up in one environment have much different levels of criminal justice involvement than kids who grew up in a different environment. And so they're being affected by the environment in very important ways. And that, I have a paper that shows that is then causally linked to the best that I can show causal, to whether you're involved in prison when you're in your 30s. So, like, for example, you're aware of research that says you come out of college during a recession, your career earnings are going to be depressed, right? Well, it's the same thing. If you come of age to your young teens, when there's a crime wave, you're going to have a much higher percent probability of being in prison when you're in your 30s than if you had come of age at a later time when crime wasn't so prevalent. So I think, how would you describe the story about the recession and your career earnings? Because these are not small differences. So would you say that's conservative? Would you say that's liberal?
Oh, I didn't mean conservative in the left-right sense. I meant in a sort of small C kind of like General Kutuzov in War and Peace, who says time and patience will solve these problems in the sense that, and you corrected me on some of it. So that's fine. But I wasn't saying, oh, you sound like a right winger on this, because right wingers aren't making the argument that you're making. I mean, the argument that you're making is that a lot of the easy fixes that a lot of right wingers propose aren't necessarily the way to fight crime, right? I mean,
or they have lots of costs that might,
right?
I think one of the things is that the best example that I have in my research is prior records, right? We went from a system that didn't really use prior records very much to one where prior records drive a lot of the probability you go to prison. In fact, a lot of the increase that you see in incarceration rates are due to the fact that the people that are coming in front of the criminal justice system now have much longer records. And what that does is it creates a situation where if you expose a generation to lots of crime because they come of age during a crime boom, they're going to be exposed to the criminal justice system at much higher rates for the remainder of their lives. And even if the probability they're going to commit crimes has dropped, because now we know that people that have records are just much more likely to be convicted if they're arrested. They're more likely to be arrested if they commit a crime. They're more likely to go to prison if they're convicted. I mean, it just keeps going higher and higher and higher. And yet the crime benefits to putting a 40-year-old in prison are pretty low. And so I think that, we repeat our mistakes in terms of, not repeat our mistakes, I shouldn't say that. But I mean, I don't think we fully understand the consequences of those things, and they last a long time, and they have consequences outside the criminal justice system. Think about the homeless population. So there's a lot of concern about this large homeless population and, and how prone to death they are. You know who they are, right? They're not 20-year-olds. They're not 25-year-olds. They're not 30-year-olds. They look like you and me, Jonah. And guess what? Almost all of them had some prior experience in the criminal justice system, right? It's, it creates consequences that you really want to think about because, and this gets back to the thing that, we're going to talk about eventually, you promised.
I promise.
Which is that people with records have problems in the labor market. And some of that's legitimate, but some of it's not. And I think that's something that I don't think people consider enough in terms of the consequences to how you respond to the criminal justice, how you respond to these sort of society-wide increases in crime and the consequences that they have over a long period of time for society as well as for individuals.
All right, so I promise we're going to get to the record stuff in just 2 seconds, but I'm just putting myself in the place of a lot of my listeners.
I don't know, Guy, I have to talk to the producer Guy because I'm not sure your track record on getting back to things in 2 seconds is all that good.
All right, well, 2 seconds is figurative, not literal.
Yeah.
That said, I understand. I think it's a very good point about how it's hard to find discrete explanations, causal explanations in national trends, right? But a lot of people will say, I can see the emails now saying, well, how do you explain San Francisco, right? That San Francisco seems to be an outlier even among national trends and the Chesa Boudin policies and the not enforcing crime stuff. And a lot of it, I don't know, I haven't looked into what the violent crime stats are for San Francisco. It seems to me that a lot of it is sort of petty larceny and also just quality of life stuff. And there are open air drug markets. It seems to me that public policy has to play a role in explaining some of that, given that at least it appears to me, both anecdotally and from what I read, that San Francisco is an outlier for these national trends as well.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in San Francisco. At least I didn't spend time boning up on San Francisco before our call. So
that's fine.
I think that I'd be careful that I'm not saying that public policy doesn't work or that, policing doesn't have an impact. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that it does. I think the question is that the behavior, as we got back to at the beginning, right? We talked about collective efficacy and the ability of communities to enforce informal social control themselves. The vast majority of crime control in this country does not happen through public policy. It happens through the actions of individuals and community. Most of the reason why people don't do things doesn't have anything to do with the criminal justice system, right? That's formal social control. There's a lot of things about informal social control that drive your behavior, whether it be the fact that Mrs. Jones is going to catch you if you do something in the neighborhood or at school, or that your mom's going to do something or find out about it, or that, your spouse might not like it if you did this or whatever. In other words, the primary glue that holds society together and creates order is informal social control, not formal social control. Formal social control kind of comes in after informal social control has failed. And so, when I'm puzzled by the fact that we don't want to examine why we've experienced, California, there was an 87% decline in violent arrests for youth. 87% in places like 1995 versus 2019. Holy Moses, why was that? What did people do? We're talking about, communities that we typically think of as high crime, including African American communities, and yet the crime dropped a lot. And do I think that's only, because of the police? No one thinks that's just because of the police. That's because something happened in these communities that led to differential behavior patterns. And why aren't we trying to find out what it is? And why aren't we trying to learn what it was that led to this? And I think Patrick Sharkey's work is important in this respect. But I think, you need the police because sometimes the informal social control doesn't work. But the vast majority of what's going on is within order in the communities has nothing to do with the police. And so I think that's, something that has to be understood, that the things that drive crime are often sort of things that are affecting the way that communities relate to one another or in the opportunities that are present, et cetera. For example, social media that makes it easy to learn how to steal Kias or whatever. But then the police can have some response to it, but that's not only that, right? So now Kia is going to fix that, right? So there's a lot less car thefts than there used to be because there are these ignition locks and other devices that policy and private security created to try to solve the problem. And then policing is part of the story, but not the whole thing.
Okay, so let's turn to your research.
Is that your way of saying you don't like that answer, Jonah, or no, do you want to hold your promise about getting back to something?
I want to keep my promise to you, and
good.
And I could pepper you with all sorts of questions about all that if you like, and we can go back and do Marvin Wolfgang again if you like that too. But I figured,
he's pulling out the heavyweights.
But I figured we should get to this. So, why don't you just sort of walk me through the key findings?
Yeah, so I think this is particularly relevant for the discussion that we're having because we have a situation where right now we have a very tight labor market. And during tight labor markets, you get to the end of the queue, and people with records are at the end of the queue. So what we're able to show is that right before COVID, when the labor market was as tight as it is now, 46% of the men who were looking for work, so they're unemployed which means they were actively in the labor market looking for work, had a criminal conviction as an adult for a non-traffic offense. And, now important to note that, it's not that, that criminal records are fairly common. 30% of all men of the same age had a record, but it was particularly common among those that were looking for work. And so if you were looking for workers, you were going to see a large number of people that have records. And so you're going to, the large employers, 95% of them do background checks. We did a survey that said that about 75% of job seekers face a criminal background check. So what are you going to do with these folks? And what we find is that there are some sectors that are more likely to hire them than others, but they were the same sectors that got hammered during COVID. So that, how do you start to encounter the ability that, if you're looking for workers, you're going to have to deal with the fact that many of them have criminal history records. So what does that mean? Well, the first thing that it means is that you can't say that everyone with a record is going to be a problem if they get hired, because crime peaks in the late teens. So, the central fact of criminal justice involvement in criminal activity is people change, right? I mean, especially to your male listeners, how many people, how many of them know someone or they themselves did something that was fairly seriously criminal when they were young? If most of you didn't just raise your hand, you're lying, right? I mean, right? And so when I say, 30% of adult males by the age of 35 in the United States have a record, if they're like our age, it would be something if all of them were still actively involved in crime. In fact, we'd have a crime rate that's something like 10 times higher than we have now, right? And so they stop. So people change, people exit, right? People are not the same when they're 35 as when they're 20. Thank God, I guess, right? I mean, that's a good thing. So the problem becomes identifying people who change. And in the old paradigm, the way people thought about this was that people with record were always higher risk than everyone else. That's just not true. There are people with records who become very low risk. And in fact, in some situations could be lower risk than the people without records. For example, consider someone who's 35, who committed a crime when he was 25, who hasn't committed a crime for the last 10 years. Who would you rather hire, him or the 22-year-old with no record? In terms of risk of offending, it's quite possible that the 22-year-old with no record has a higher chance of getting arrested in the next year. So you really want to think this through. But the problem, I think, is that the policy discussion about how to do this is fairly limited. And it's based on some bad facts, which is a real problem. And that, so I'll ask you a question, Jonah. What do you think the single biggest thing that government, policymakers, and employers look at when they look at a criminal history record? What feature of the criminal history record do you think they focus on?
I honestly have no idea, but if I put on the spot, I would say whether it was violent or not.
Thank you. Yeah, type of crime. So the question is, is it violent? Was it a felony? If you're going to hire someone to be a cashier, whether they committed crimes with money before, things like that. So type of crime is the single biggest factor. It's the factor that the government says you can use. It is also unpredictive of your chances of offending in the future once you control for age and the number of times you've been convicted in the past. So let me just repeat that. The single biggest factor is crime type, and that factor is well known in criminology circles to not be predictive of anything. And the reason is because people who commit crimes are not specialists. Right? You're a specialist. You do podcasts and say wise things about Methuselah or whoever that you bring up on a regular basis, right? But that's not the way people who are involved in crime are, right? So people who deal drugs also commit violence. They also steal stuff, right? There's a generalist element, and the best way to sum this up is when criminologists try to come up with a number between 0 and 1, where 1 is you always commit violent crime, you're a specialist, and 0 is you randomly commit property violent crime. The number that you come up with is like 0.17. People are generalists, and so the information about type of crime is not predictive. And there's a reason why people think it is, and it's called hindsight bias, right? So you come up with someone and you say, oh, gee, suppose you hired someone and he committed a violent crime on the job, and you look back and you go, oh, he committed a violent crime before. You should have known. Well, the problem is there's a lot of people who committed violent crime who didn't go on to commit another crime, right? You can't see the desisters. You only see the guys that committed another crime. And the predictive power of that is pretty low.
Does that hold across all crime types?
It's largely true for all crime types. There are certain crime types that are slightly more likely to be specialized. Mm-hmm. Sex offenses is an example of something that looks more specialist. And remember, I'm saying once you control for a number of crimes, right? DWI, for example. But once I, control for the fact that you've had 3 previous crimes, i.e. 3 previous DWIs, it's no more predictive to know that you have a DWI than anything else. But I think, the degree of specialization let me just give you two numbers and see if it makes sense to you. So if you look at people coming out of prison for sex crimes, right? Those that were in prison for a sex crime are 4 times more likely to commit a sex crime in the next 5 years than the people who weren't in prison for a sex crime. That sounds like a specialist, right? Well, let me tell you the next part of the number, which is that the probability they're going to commit another sex crime is 2%. So 2% of the time, they're going to commit another sex crime, and they're going to recidivate about half the time for something else. In other words, 96% of the time when they commit another crime, they're not going to commit a sex crime. And so, and the number for people that didn't commit a sex crime is like 0.5%. So they're much more likely to commit lots of other things than they are commit sex crimes. So what are you going to feature? The fact that they're more likely to commit a sex crime, or you're going to focus on the fact they're committing other crimes as well? And so I think that the reality is we just have a tendency to look backwards. And yet when we're talking about prediction, you have to think forward. You have to look at everybody who's in the set of what could be done and then consider what happens going next. And when you do that, there's just not a lot of evidence of specialization. And so a lot of the policies that are preventing people from working are based on this idea that type of crime matters, and it doesn't, at least when it comes to predicting recidivism. And that's a really profound thing, because one of the issues that comes up is the EEOC has a jurisdiction in this area, right? Because criminal history records are correlated with race. And so you can't use features that are correlated with race if they have disparate impact. But the single biggest factor they'd say you can use is crime type, because it's apparent, they said back in the 70s that it's correlated with recidivism. It isn't. And so I think, what we have as a situation is, so I've been able to show in research that I did in New York, where if you consider crime type as required by state statute, you do 2 things. One, you do not improve your prediction ability whatsoever, and you increase the racial disparity in the hiring process. So it's like the worst of both worlds. So we're currently using a feature that is not predictive and increases racial disparity. So, what that means is there's a lot of people that could be working that are not given an opportunity because of ill-considered ideas about what's relevant. There are other things that help you predict, like age and the number of priors. But, the single biggest thing is how many years it's been since you were involved in the criminal justice system. As you get longer and longer, it's much less likely. The other thing that really, if you work in this space, and remember, this is really relevant because there's a lot of people looking for workers, and there's a lot of workers, many of whom have criminal justice records, who want to work. And but the problem comes up is that they're not being allowed, and yet the evidence is overwhelming that they've actually that they've changed, that they've desisted, they've moved on to a different path. So you hear these crazy stories about someone was working in my store for 3 years. They were a great employee. They got promoted to management. We did a background check and we found that they had a record 6 years ago. And now I'm not going to promote them. And in fact, I'm going to fire them. When what's the most relevant piece of information here? The fact that 6 years ago they committed a crime, or that they worked for you for 3 years and were a great employee? And it's stunning to me that people aren't believing their own eyes, right? Because people are not taking into account the fact that people change. And they do.
It's funny. I mean, just as an anecdote, I have a friend who's very successful in the financial sector. And they had a situation like that where a guy was working in IT. Turned out that he had a criminal record. He lied on the application about it. And they really agonized about it. And they wanted to keep him on. They thought, he gave every bit of evidence that his life has changed. The problem is that when you're dealing with outside investors and financial regulators,
yep,
they had no choice. They gave him a very generous severance. They helped him find a different job, but at the same time, they couldn't keep him on even if they wanted to, because they would be in breach of all sorts of other legal,
Right. We've created a system that's based on a false premise, right? A lot of the rules are government generated about who can work and who cannot work in certain environments. And in certain situations, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Do we really want people that have been convicted of child sex offenses to be working with children? even, and I think, none of my evidence is going to make you, first of all, there's not enough evidence on child sex offenses, which thank God are very rare. But also abundance of conscience, really vulnerable victims. Let's not go there. But there's a lot of other places where, the evidence is, very clear that this isn't predictive, and you're just creating racial disparity without any benefit. We're sort of stuck in this environment where policies created in the 70s, which is when this really started to go, aren't based on good science. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? And I don't know, but I think it's a really important time to have this conversation, both because of what we started talking about, right? Are we going to make the criminal justice system harsh again so that we create lots of people with records, so that we then have to worry about this in 20 years? And what are we going to do about this tight labor market where a lot of the people who are looking for work and would make good employees have criminal history records? Continuing to punish companies as well as individuals for things that they did in the past that they've moved away from. It seems, especially when you have additional information on people, like, hey, look, they were an employee for 3 years, is I think really problematic.
What would be your preferred policy approach on this? Would it be to prohibit employers from asking about criminal records, or just simply let the market, let employers ask what they want to ask or not want to ask? Or is it, how do you approach it?
Yeah, so I think that, one of the classic responses to this for people that are concerned about people with records is to say, let's ban criminal background checks. The problem, I think, is that employers want this access to this information. There's real concern about liability risk, but also about performance on the job, about the way people deal with clients, all kinds of things, right? And so, people often use examples like in Europe, where they don't have access to records in nearly the same ease as we do. And the weird thing there is now in Europe, it's becoming much more common for companies to do background checks. So I think denying employers access to information that they think is important is never a good idea, because they then start using other information that might be correlated with that. And that's going to have negative effects on, for example, racial groups like African Americans, who might have higher probabilities of records, particularly those people without records, right, who won't have any way of identifying themselves as having no record. So what I think is much wiser is to have really good information systems where you have reliable criminal history records, which we don't have in the United States very well for a number of different reasons, I should say. And then the other thing we should do is have intelligent use of criminal history records, right? Don't use factors and feature factors that don't matter. And the biggest element of that is crime type. That is given way more importance than it should in terms of what people say should matter, which is the risk of committing another crime. And so I think we could have a more intelligent use. We could have better information that's being used. And then we could also use that information more wisely in ways that provide a realistic picture and provide a pathway for people who have committed crimes to make it and reintegrate into society, which is, after all, the goal, right? If every single person with a record can never get a job again, this is not going to be good for the rest of us.
Right. And also, you can be a real law and order type, but if you've paid your debt to society, as the phrase goes, then you've paid your debt to society. It shouldn't be a lifetime mark of Cain that says, oh, and by the way, it's 5 years in jail and you can't get a job for the rest of your life. That wasn't what a jury ruled, right? Or what a judge sentenced someone to. And
just remember, we're talking about a lot of people, right? We're talking about, 50% of the men by the time they're 50 are going to have at least an arrest and possibly a conviction, right? We're talking about huge parts of the population that are going to get involved in the criminal justice system. And so I think, and that's true in Europe, it's true in the United States. And so you have to be really careful. It's one thing if you think it's a small part of the population, but it's not. And so you have to be really considerate of that. And that's one of the hopeful things is a lot of people with records have jobs. Employers regularly hire people with records. You may not know them, but they do. And employers are willing to hire more people with records when given incentives to do so. So this isn't an either or situation. It's could we think about ways to do this in such a way that more people are integrated in the community? And since I've done some of the work that shows that people who want to work, who can't work, are more likely to commit crimes, we as a society will benefit more if we find ways to make this happen. The hard part is that the company doesn't benefit. When Jonah doesn't commit a crime because he has a job, the company doesn't benefit for the most part because those crimes are usually committed off the job. But I do as a society, as a member of society, I benefit that Jonah's not out there running around doing crime. And so we as a society have some incentive to try to find ways to solve this problem. And I think we are in a good place to do so now with a really tight labor market because there's a lot of people looking for workers. And one of the group that's left that doesn't have the jobs is people with records. And the records are one of the reasons why they're not getting employed.
So I have a sort of just a broad brush methodological question, which I'm sure you deal with in some of your intro classes, but is one of the reasons why the people with one crime, on their record, that it's not predictive of future crimes is because the people for whom one crime would have been predictive went on to commit more crimes. And so they're not in the sample anymore, right? I mean, are the people inclined to be repeat offenders? They're not out looking for jobs because they're already in jail. I mean, how?
Yeah, this is a really good. I hate when people say it's a good question. Like I become the arbiter for a good question, but that is the heart of the matter. So one of the things that people often say is that we know that almost everybody coming out of prison recidivates. So it must be that everybody recidivates. Well, it turns out that's not the right sample. There are statistics in the Bureau of Justice Statistics that says, okay, for example, of all those people who left prison in 2004, 80% of them get rearrested in the next 9 years. So you say, well, gee, everybody recidivates. The problem is the group of people that got released from prison in 2004 is not a random sample of everybody that went to prison. Because it's overrepresenting the people that failed multiple times. So a lot of the people who go to prison are what you said, frequent offenders. And there are many people that go to prison or get convicted for the first time and never get convicted again. So they are less likely to show up in a sample if you just grab a group of people that are exiting prison in any given year. And so you're overestimating the actual recidivism risk by 30 to 40%, depending on what measure you're talking about. And even more than that, if you're talking about convictions. And that's really important to remember because it's exactly what you said. The guy that offends once, gets convicted and never shows up again, right, isn't going to be collected in a sample of recidivists. And so we have these great statistics on recidivism from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that are wonderful for the criminal justice system. They're fantastic. Right? If I'm a prison superintendent and I want to know who's going to fail, those are the numbers I want to know. But if I'm thinking about from an employer's perspective, who do I want to know about? Well, I want to know the people who are free in the community who haven't committed another crime. And the people that have failed, I don't really care about because they're not available for work anyways. And so the recidivism risk for those people that are free in community and haven't committed another crime is much lower than the numbers that get thrown around here. And that's a real frustration, right? Because it's based on bad facts again. I was very happy that you brought that up. It's almost like I told you about it ahead of time, which I didn't for the record, because it's a really important thing that people fail to understand. They keep repeating these recidivism statistics by the government, which are intended for the use of the criminal justice system and not for, say, groups like employers who are concerned about the recidivism of people who've ever been to prison or ever been convicted.
This is a slightly different issue because the people that you're talking about are essentially a different population. But this Daniel Penny case in New York City, the guy who put the homeless guy in a chokehold, and if you read the record of the person he killed, this guy you keep mentioning, our similar ages. I grew up in New York City in the 70s and 80s, and there's a real Larry Hogue, Madman on 96th Street vibe to the guy who died. I'm not trying to disparage him. The whole thing is tragic, but I think the tragedy is in part because this young man had serious mental health issues. He was on a list of the most concerning cases in the entire system. And there were, talk about hindsight bias, there were a number of times where this guy did really terrible things, and the system sort of said, we're going to look the other way. I'm just, for the sort of conservative kid who grew up in New York City dealing with all the crime stuff, this thing really just pings a lot of, nostalgia is the wrong word, but it feels like very much a flashback to arguments we had in the 70s and 80s, particularly about the mentally ill. I'm just wondering, how do you look at cases like that? I think everyone sort of agrees that our mental health system has really failed a lot of people, but it overlaps so much with crime. And I think a lot of the things that piss off people about crime are really things that they should be pissed off about the mental health system. But I'm just wondering how you think about it.
Well, to stay on the thread for a second, that person, I think there was one year that person had 20 criminal justice convictions or experiences with the criminal justice system. So if you just look at people that are going in and out of the system in any given year, that guy is going to be a big part of the story, right? However, that guy wasn't looking for a job. He wasn't trying to get employed. He wasn't capable of that. And so we should be very careful when talking about, if you're talking about people that are in the labor market looking for work, not letting statistics that are driven by individuals like that, who are deeply embedded in the criminal justice system, among other things, drive your perception of what recidivism looks like. And because I'm telling you, the recidivism rates for the population of people who are looking for work, who have a criminal history record, are far lower than the overall population of people who came out of prison yesterday or have a criminal conviction, right? So we really have to be careful. And that's why we've titled our work at RAND, Resetting the Record, because you really want to think about, when you're talking about employment, you want to be talking about the population of people who are looking for work. And that's a very different population than the overall population of people involved in the criminal justice system, which is dominated by people that are, very frequent involvement with the criminal justice system. So we'll go to Marvin Wolfgang because you want to so bad, but Wolfgang, had the result that said 5% of the people who get arrested are responsible for 50% of all arrests, right? So there's a few people that are responsible.
No, all crimes, right?
Well, you can't say crimes because you don't have the data on all crimes. So he often used the word crimes, but he meant the word arrests because that's what he had records of.
Okay.
Right. So I try to use the word I mean, which in this case is the data I have, which is arrests.
All right.
But yeah, so arrests. And so, it really is the case that if you allow your perception to be driven by that 5%, you will drastically overestimate the involvement in the criminal justice system of the other things. Now, is there a room for a discussion about what to do with individuals like that? Yes. Is there, and I think the system was trying it. I think New York is at the forefront of things like that. I mean, New York has an incredible track record of not holding people on detention pre-trial, right? I mean, they have the lowest rate of pre-trial detention in the country by a lot. And they've done a lot of things that are very focused on the individual, but there are limits, particularly in the current legal landscape, about what you can do in terms of commitment. And so I think there's some, is it possible that we might want to have a system that we can allow people to be committed? And I'm not qualified to have that conversation, but it is a conversation that we've had in the past and made a decision that it should be very, very difficult to commit someone against their will, at which point people's hands are tied, and then you blame the cops, right? And I think that's really unfortunate because it's, people who become police officers didn't become social workers, right? They're there as elements of formal social control. And I don't know about you, but I'm not really excited about living in a world without some element of formal social control. And I don't think most people are either. But they're not, that formal social control is only part of the story. And And I do think we have to have a more active conversation about what to do with individuals who are, have mental health or other issues that are leading to their behavior problems that are affecting everyone else.
It seems to me, getting back to your work, if I were an employer looking to hire somebody who roughly fit the demographic profile of someone who had been in jail but was turning their life around and all of that, the thing I would want to focus on more than anything else, perhaps, I still would want to know the type of crime, to be brutally honest. I don't know if I could ever let that go. I understand all your cautions about it not being predictive and all of that, but I'd want to have a conversation about what happened, kind of thing. But the thing I would be very much interested in is their drug test results. And it seems to me that I would rather have for sure somebody who had a conviction from when they were young. They made a mistake. Young men do stupid things. I will not recount all the stupid things I did when I was young. I understand that entirely. But there are all sorts of jobs that it just seems to me, we can have an argument about weed, but any drug beyond weed, there are lots of jobs for which that just simply has to be a non-starter. And I'm wondering, how much does that play into these kinds of questions for you?
So let me back up one step and simply say that I'm not saying that employers shouldn't be worried about crime type, because there's lots of reasons they should be worried about crime type, but the reasons have nothing to do with predicting recidivism, right? So they can get sued for negligent hiring, and hindsight bias is a big feature there, and you have to acknowledge that. It's also brand awareness. And so I think you should be aware of what person crime they committed, but I think you ought to be very careful about using that as the only feature. And what you just said is essentially that their current behavior, i.e. drug use, matters a lot for describing where they are currently. And I think that's the central element, is that judging people by what they did before, as opposed to what they're doing now, seems really problematic, because what they're doing now is the key story, right? The person, you hear these stories about the person who was involved in drugs. You meet these people, right? They were involved in drugs. They were heavily addicted. They did a bunch of things that are really bad. They go to prison. They come out. They are no longer involved in drugs. They are not using anymore. They've changed their lives. You can see they changed their life. They've done education programs. They did this. They did that. They did the other thing. They're not the same person who committed the crime that put them in prison. And at some point, you have to acknowledge that is real, because it is. And so using measures of the current behavior, whether it be drug use or something else that tells you what they're currently doing, is really important. And when that information is used, you don't need the other information. And that's the part that's really problematic, right? Where people act as if the old information is more relevant or important than the information about what people are currently doing. And that's just simply not the case. And so I think focusing on drug tests, or whether or not they showed up to their rehabilitation programs or to their training programs, and whether they're on time, and whether someone would vouch for them in the community, tells you a lot about where they are, and recognizing that, because people do desist, people do change. Even people that are pretty heavily involved in crime change. I'm sure you've met them. I have too, where people that committed terrible things when they were in their 20s and 30s are now very different people.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's been a while since I read up on it, but I know there's a big chunk of social science research on this applying to terrorists, right? And that middle-aged terrorist, which sometimes is a rare breed, but the really heinous acts that are committed by Islamic Jihad or whatever, it's the young men who are doing it, and people age out of that, where there are an enormous number of social and institutional pressures to sort of stay in the terrorism game, but people lose their taste for doing terrible things, even when there's an entire nationalistic, ideological, religious, narrative supporting it. And then at some point, someone just says, "Yeah, I'm done with this." And you can imagine where there's much less of that. There's something roughly analogous in some gangs, I suppose, But really, it's like being in a gang is weird if you're past 30 years old,
Well, a gang membership isn't nearly as long term as people think it is.
Right.
It's got the same sort of people are in, people out kind of trajectory.
This is probably a somewhat depressing question, but how optimistic or hopeful are you about your recommendations actually working their way in anytime soon into sort of public policy and politics?
So I tell you a funny story. The first time I ever went in front of a corporate group to talk about this, I was invited to talk to a large employer, and they wanted to know what the criminology literature said about predicting risk. And the first thing I said is crime type doesn't predict anything in terms once you control for age and type of crime. I was immediately dismissed from the room, and then I sat for 8 hours in a small office by myself until the end of the day, while the person that brought me there tried to explain what I was saying. So the good news is that happened a long time ago, and that doesn't happen anymore. And so I'm probably preternaturally optimistic, and I have been doing this since 1995. So, but I do think that there is a growing awareness about the problem with taking a group of people and automatically taking them out of the workforce and other elements of society. And that there is a growing sense of, and I think the tight labor market creates an opportunity for that conversation. And so do I see people more willing to consider ideas than they used to be? Yeah. Think about ban the box. 10 years ago, ban the box was a crazy idea that no one used, right? And now it's, more or less the rule of the land, and especially for big employers. So, I think change can happen in this space. And I think, but you never know, right? It's one of these things where when you start out doing research like this is my main area of research. It's not my only area, but it's my main area. And when you start out, like when I first started doing work in the space when I was in 1996, I was told to leave the area because no one cared. 5 years later, people started to care, and now my work is cited in the EEOC, and I talk to people like you. I say I'd like to talk about this, and you don't tell me to go shut up. Maybe it's because you were stuck in Nantucket and you haven't talked to anybody for a couple of weeks. But I'm optimistic that this is an important topic that affects a lot of people, and it has a lot of policy implications both upstream and downstream. And so, and I do see some evidence that people are willing to engage with the topic in new ways. So, you can't do this and not be somewhat optimistic and by nature. But yeah, I think there's change possible.
On one front, you're trying to change attitudes and perceptions in the private sector. You talk about going to this conference and explaining these things, right? And then there's being able to change public policy. Is there a specific law that is on the books that is making this the acute problem that it is, or is it really just a bundle of precedents, policies, and everything in between?
The common number is something like 30,000 federal and state and local regulations that prevent people from hiring individuals with records. So it's not one, it's a lot. And a lot of it's based only on crime type, which is largely not helpful. What you're trying to do is predict risk. So I don't think it's any one thing. In terms of a federal policy, I do think there's federal policy that's possible here in the sense that we as a society benefit when people with records get to work. Not everybody, but there's a large group of people with records that want to work and would make good employees. But when they can't work, they actually do have a higher chance of going to commit crime. And that's not good for us. And so we as a society would benefit if employers had more incentives to hire people. And there are things that government can do to change the incentives. And their current efforts in the space are very, very small. So there is a tax credit, but it's only available for 6 months after you leave prison for very serious crimes. It's not very effective. They have an insurance program called the federal bonding program that's been around for 40, 50, 60 years, something like that. But it's extremely small. And yet there's evidence that employers are responsive to those. Not every employer is going to change their view, but there will be some. And we as a society will benefit from that if that in fact was the case. And so I think there are policies that can be done proactively. In other words, positive things you can do. And there's also other things, maybe rethink all of the restrictions that are currently in place that place limitations on people who might well be good employees. And so I think it's sort of a both and kind of story in terms of things that can be done.
All right. So one last question, and I'll set you free. We probably talked about this last time. I just can't remember. It was a lot of day drinking. But so you talked about how ban the box was once sort of this radical harebrained thing, and now it's the law of the land. The push during the pandemic, during the George Floyd period, where I think a lot of people did a lot of damage to the causes they hold dear by pushing the whole defund the police thing. It was amazing to me how many sort of mainstream sort of liberal media types and politicians, it showed a certain amount of sort of groupthink and bubble, and sort of, you could get on MSNBC with an academic credential and make it sound as if this was a mainstream point of view among academics who look at the criminal justice system. And you'd also go on TV as an activist and say that this was the view of the typical African American, that they wanted to defund the police. And yet every time I looked at the polling, it's like, there's just zero evidence that your average African American citizen in this country wants zero police. 60-70% said they wanted more police. It's like 90% said more police or the same amount, and somewhere between 10 and 20% said fewer police. But there's an enormous quantitative difference between saying fewer and none, right? And yet this thing got so much oxygen that it allowed conservative right-wing types to say, see, they really want to get rid of all the police, which was not true of most Democrats. It was not true. And so I guess part of my question is, you travel in these circles, you go to these conferences, like how many actual people who are actually doing real criminology work, real sort of recidivism work and all that kind of stuff actually believe in the defund the police, sort of the hard version of the defund the police thing, not like more resources being sent to social workers. There's some perfectly colorable, fine arguments on that front. I mean, the stuff like, I remember the New York Times, it got to the point where the narrative about defund the police got to the point where lots of politicians were saying, look, defund the police doesn't mean abolish the police, right? And so the New York Times went and found some academic who said, and they put it in the headline, when we say abolish the police, yes, we mean abolish the police. How fringe a point of view is that, or is that an actual real point of view among people who in your world?
I mean, I'm not running in the advocacy circles. I'm a scientist. And so you can see I can give you lots of opinions about what I think you should do. I spend a lot of time trying to tell you about the facts of the case. There are plenty of people who would be considered criminologists, typically considered critical criminologists, who believe that.
As in critical theory kind of criminal?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh-huh.
There's a whole group of critical criminologists who believe that. And I've definitely had people say in my presence, everyone believes this. And I query as to whether I should raise my hand and say, well, I'm not sure I believe that. So I think it's a strong undercurrent. But I think there's also a large group of people that sort of know the evidence that you suggested. And, there's just not a lot of evidence that people want to live in a world without some formal social control. Now, again, recognizing that formal social control should be an element of what you're doing to provide a society we all want to live in, not the only thing. It's a sign of failure, right? If you have to go and put someone out in the street to prevent crime, it meant that all the other things that should have prevented crime didn't work, right? And so, it's not a thing you should be proud of that you have to do. Obviously, it would be great if we all lived in a society with no cops. But it isn't the case that's true. And so, and I agree with you that this perception, particularly that, African Americans don't want to have police, that's just completely not true. But it is a general, it is a way of thinking that exists in criminology. I have no sense of how many or what the percentage is.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's just one of these things where it's like radical. It's like there are all sorts of analogs, radical libertarian types who think the average American wants to get rid of vast swaths of government. Would that were the case, but that's just not the case. Similarly, this idea that, the average African American person, one of the ironies of all this is that the median African American voter is now sort of to the right of the Democratic Party. They're the ones who got Joe Biden elected. And, the idea that middle-class black ladies in South Carolina want no police is just, it's such a obviously bad political idea. And I think it's bad for the discourse because it's sort of like what my former colleague David French, always like to call nut picking, is it allows people to take the most extreme form of an argument and say, see, this is what all those people believe. And it turns out, I have all sorts of differences with all sorts of Democrat, like what's his name, Clyburn. But, Clyburn doesn't want to get rid of police. And when you talk like that, it becomes very difficult. It becomes very easy for a lot of people to dismiss anybody because they think it's all slippery slope towards, the defund the police position. And that's just a loser politically.
I'll give you an example of where that kind of plays in. I've done some recent work. I just got a paper published with two colleagues, three colleagues, John Emberg and Lucy Sorensen, the grad student, and Avila Acosta is the last name of the grad student. I don't want to leave her out. She's great. And we had the first national study of school resource officers and to look what their impact is on crime in the schools or problems in the school. And oftentimes when people do this kind of research, they only focus on the negative things that happen when cops go into school, suspensions and remembering, of course, that cops don't suspend anyone in schools, that principals do. But and it's really interesting as to what gets the weight in different environments. But what we've been able to show consistently with a couple of different studies is that cops do, in fact, reduce the amount of, I want to say serious violence, but I don't mean shootings because it's impossible to study shootings because they're so rare. But, reasonably serious violence like fistfights and things. But it also is the case that you have more arrests and the principals end up suspending more people. And those people tend to be minorities. And so there are costs to the use of police. But to pretend that the costs, that there aren't also benefits is, I think, ignoring the evidence. And so, are there things you can do that are less costly that have some of the same benefits? Maybe. And if there is, maybe we should do those. But, the alternative to, pretending that that's not going to happen, you may have some very, situations that might not be so great. And you'll see lots of that backlash in the school resource officers, right? And there was Denver got rid of all the school resource officers in the schools. They had a situation where a kid with a gun, your kid who kept threatening to bring a gun to school was being searched by non-cops. And he had brought a gun to school one day, and when they searched him, they shot him. And so what happened the next day is they had cops in all the schools. And a lot of people felt pretty good about that. Are there costs to that? Yes. But, people do feel better when there's some form of social control. And unfortunately, there are environments where that's in fact the case. So I do think that a more nuanced version of that, where you understand that there are costs and benefits and there are decisions you can make, seems to be an irrelevant conversation. But as you pointed out, nuance is not always the point of the realm when it comes to media discussions about these things. In fact, I think earlier in this conversation, you referred to nuance in a bad way.
I did not.
You did. You accused me of nuance as if I had, sort of hurt your dog, which I know better than hurt your dog.
You're so thin-skinned about this stuff. I mean, really.
Oh my gosh, thin-skinned.
Thin-skinned. All right, Shawn Bushway, thank you so much for doing this. We will have you back. And if you know Shawn, tell him that he was too thin-skinned and I was right about everything. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Professor Bushway has left the studio. I apologize if his audio was a little off. He had equipment failure right before we started recording, and we had to make do. And And no one should hold it against him that he was trying to pick fights with me a couple of times. That's all fine. We talked about it afterwards. I thought he was, I think it's a really interesting point. It's counterintuitive for a lot of people, but I think it's worth, really thinking about it as a matter of social policy. I think, as listeners probably know, I sort of come from a pretty straightforward certainty of punishment is more important than certainty of punishment, as in like making sure that you if you commit a crime, that there are consequences for it quickly and clearly is more important than having like really draconian prison sentences and all those kinds of things. But I'm also, I'm more sympathetic to the broken windows stuff than I think Shawn is. But I also think he's probably entirely right that everything is more complicated. I mean, this podcast stands for very little if it doesn't stand against monocausal explanations of things. And not sure when this is going to air. It may air as quickly as tomorrow, or it may air later. I am not sure. We are on a marathon of racking them, stacking them in terms of podcasts. And so I don't want to say anything to you that's particularly dated because I don't know when this is going to be released. So thanks for listening. Please become a Dispatch subscriber if you can. It's really important. We think it's really worth the money and your time. And that's the one thing that we really sort of one of our editorial lodestars is not wasting your time. So in that spirit, I'll stop wasting your time and say, I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.